The blizzard that swept across the Colorado Territory in December of 1878 was the kind of storm that old-timers would talk about for decades afterward. A furious wall of snow and wind that reduced visibility to mere feet and turned familiar landmarks into ghostly shadows in a world gone white. Jake Morrison hunched deeper into his heavy coat as he guided his horse along what he hoped was still the trail leading back to his cabin, the animal's labored breathing creating clouds of vapor that were instantly torn away by the howling wind. Jake was a man of 35 years who had spent the better part of 2 decades learning to survive in the harsh mountain country of Colorado, first as a prospector chasing rumors of gold and silver, later as a hunter and trapper who supplied meat and furs to the growing settlements in the valleys below. He was tall and lean, built like the mountains themselves, with hands that had learned to be gentle despite their obvious strength, and eyes that had seen enough of life's cruelties to appreciate its rare moments of beauty and grace. The storm had caught him returning from a supply run to the trading post at Elkhorn Creek, his saddlebags loaded with coffee, flour, ammunition, and the few other necessities that sustained his solitary existence in a cabin he had built with his own hands. In a hidden valley 20 miles from the nearest neighbor, he had hoped to reach shelter before the worst of the weather arrived, but the blizzard had descended with the sudden fury that characterized mountain storms, transforming a routine journey into a fight for survival. As his horse struggled through snow that was already knee-deep and getting deeper by the hour, Jake's attention was caught by something that seemed impossible in this empty wilderness. The sound of a baby crying, thin and desperate above the roar of the wind. At first, he thought it might be his imagination, a trick of the storm playing on his mind after hours of battling the elements. But as he guided his horse toward a cluster of snow-covered boulders that offered slight protection from the wind, the sound became unmistakably real and heartbreakingly urgent. Half hidden behind the rocks, almost completely buried in the rapidly accumulating snow, Jake found a small bundle wrapped in what had once been a warm blanket, but was now soaked through and frozen stiff. Inside the inadequate covering was a baby girl, perhaps 6 months old, her tiny face blue with cold, and her cries growing weaker with each passing moment. She was so small that Jake could hold her easily in one arm, and so close to death from exposure that he knew she had only minutes before the cold claimed her forever. "Sweet Jesus," Jake whispered, his voice barely audible above the storm as he cradled the infant against his chest, trying to share what warmth he could through his heavy coat. Who would leave a baby out here to die? What kind of person abandons a child in weather like this? The questions would haunt him for years to come, but in that moment, his focus was entirely on the immediate problem of keeping the baby alive long enough to reach his cabin and the warmth of a proper fire. He quickly stripped off his own wool shirt and wrapped it around the infant, then tucked her inside his coat where she could benefit from his body heat during the remaining miles home. The ride back to his cabin through the blizzard became a race against time and the elements, with Jake pushing his horse as hard as he dared while protecting the precious bundle nestled against his chest. The baby had stopped crying, which worried him more than her earlier distress, and he could feel how cold her tiny body had become despite his efforts to warm her. Every few minutes, he would check to make sure she was still breathing. His heart clenching with fear each time he felt how weak and irregular her pulse had become. Jake's cabin appeared through the swirling snow like a beacon of salvation, its solid log walls and stone chimney promising the warmth and shelter that might save the baby's life. He had built the structure himself over the course of 2 summers, designing it to withstand the worst weather the mountains could deliver while providing comfortable living space for a man who valued self-sufficiency above all other considerations. Once, Inside, Jake's first priority was building up the fire in his stone fireplace until the flames roared with enough heat to begin warming the frozen infant. He stripped away her wet clothing and wrapped her in his warmest blankets, then held her close to the fire while he tried to determine what else he could do to help her recover from her ordeal in the snow. The baby was clearly malnourished, as well as half-frozen, her tiny body showing the effects of inadequate feeding over what might have been weeks or months. She was much too young to eat solid food, but Jake had no milk to offer her, no way to provide the nourishment that was as critical to her survival as warmth and shelter. "Come on, little one," Jake murmured as he held the baby close to the warmth of the fire, his voice carrying the kind of desperate encouragement that people offered when prayer seemed insufficient. "You've made it this far. Don't give up on me now. We'll figure out how to take care of you somehow." As the hours passed and the baby's breathing gradually became stronger and more regular, Jake began to consider the practical implications of what had happened. He was a bachelor living alone in the wilderness, with no experience caring for infants and no knowledge of what babies needed beyond warmth, food, and basic shelter. He had never even held a baby before tonight, had never imagined himself responsible for another human being's welfare, especially one so small and vulnerable. But as he looked down at the tiny face that was beginning to show some color as warmth returned to her body, Jake felt something stir in his chest that he had never experienced before. This wasn't just responsibility or obligation. It was something deeper and more powerful, a protective instinct that seemed to come from the very core of his being. The baby's eyes opened for the first time since he had found her, revealing irises the color of spring violets that looked up at him with the kind of trust that only children could offer so completely. She was beautiful, he realized, despite the ordeal she had endured, with delicate features and fine blonde hair that suggested she came from good stock. Whatever circumstances had led to her abandonment. "Well, little miss," Jake said softly, "looks like it's just you and me against the world. I don't know much about babies, but I know about surviving in tough places, and I promise you this, you're never going to be cold or hungry or abandoned again. Whatever it takes, however I have to change my life, you're going to be safe and loved." Tuck, promise was made to a baby who couldn't understand the words, but Jake meant every syllable with the kind of fierce determination that had sustained him through years of hardship and solitude. He didn't know her name, didn't know where she had come from or who had left her to die in the snow, but none of that mattered. She was his responsibility now, his family, and he would move heaven and earth to give her the life she deserved. The storm continued to rage outside his cabin. Jake began making plans for the dramatic changes that would be necessary to transform his solitary existence into a home suitable for raising a child. He would need to learn about infant care, would have to find sources of milk and proper food, would have to consider how to provide education and social contact as she grew older. But first, she needed a name. As he looked down at her peaceful vase in the firelight, with snow still falling outside the windows, and the memory of her near-death fresh in his mind, inspiration struck him with sudden clarity. "Snow," he said quietly, testing the sound of it. "That's what I'll call you. Snow Morrison, because that's where I found you, and Morrison because you're my daughter now, no matter what blood runs in your veins." The baby made a small sound that might have been approval, and Jake smiled for the first time in hours. Snow Morrison it would be, and he would spend the rest of his life making sure that the harsh circumstances of her beginning would be transformed into a foundation for the kind of happiness and love that every child deserved. Outside, the blizzard continued its assault on the mountain wilderness, but inside Jake's cabin, a new family had been born from the most unlikely circumstances. Neither of them could have imagined that night how profoundly they would change each other's lives, or how the love between an abandoned baby and a lonely mountain man would become the greatest treasure either of them would ever possess. 10 years had passed since that fateful blizzard night when Jake Morrison found a dying baby in the snow, and the changes those years had brought to his life were more profound than anything he could have imagined. The remote mountain cabin that had once served as a simple shelter for a solitary man had been transformed into a warm and welcoming home filled with laughter, learning, and the kind of domestic happiness that Jake had never dared to hope for. Snow. Morrison, at 10 years old, was a remarkable child who combined her father's practical intelligence with a natural grace and beauty that turned heads whenever they made their infrequent trips to town for supplies. She had grown into a bright, confident girl with long blonde hair that caught sunlight like spun gold and violet eyes that sparkled with curiosity about everything the world had to offer. But more importantly, she possessed the kind of character that came from being raised with love, discipline, and the knowledge that she was valued for who she was rather than what she might become. Jake had proven himself to be a surprisingly capable father despite his complete lack of experience with children. The first few years had been challenging as he learned to manage the practical aspects of caring for an infant in the wilderness, from finding reliable sources of milk to dealing with childhood illnesses without access to medical care. But his determination to give Snow the best life possible had driven him to master every skill necessary for her welfare, from cooking nutritious meals to teaching her to read using books ordered from Denver and delivered by the occasional supply wagons that made their way into the mountains. "Papa Jake," Snow called out one autumn morning as she helped him prepare for their monthly supply run to Elkhorn Creek. "Can we visit Mrs. Henderson at the school again? She said she has new books that might be suitable for my reading level." Jake smiled at the formal way his daughter phrased her request, a habit she had developed from spending so much time with adults and reading books written for educated audiences. Snow's intelligence had become apparent early in her childhood, and Jake had made enormous efforts to provide her with educational opportunities that matched her capabilities despite their remote location. "Of course we can visit Mrs. Henderson," Jake replied, checking the harness on their wagon one final time. "In fact, I've been thinking it might be time for you to spend more time at the school. Maybe even consider boarding in town during the winter months so you can attend classes regularly." The suggestion brought a look of alarm to Snow's face that made Jake's heart ache, with the realization that his daughter's happiness and his own were becoming increasingly difficult to balance. She clearly needed more educational and social opportunities than he could provide in their mountain isolation. But the thought of being separated from her, even temporarily, was almost unbearable for a man who had built his entire life around her welfare. "I don't want to live in town," Snow said firmly, her violet eyes flashing with the kind of determination that reminded Jake of his own stubborn streak. "I want to stay here with you, in our home. Can't you teach me whatever I need to know?" "I can teach you what I know," Jake said gently, "but that's not the same as what you could learn from proper teachers, from books and equipment that I can't provide up here. You're too smart to waste your potential just because your old man is afraid of letting you grow up." The conversation continued during their journey down the mountain trail toward Elkhorn Creek, with Snow arguing passionately for staying home, and Jake trying to explain why her education and future opportunities had to take precedence over his own emotional needs. It was a discussion they had been having more frequently as Snow approached an age where her intellectual gifts required resources that their mountain home couldn't provide. Elkhorn Creek had grown considerably since Jake first started making supply runs there, evolving from a rough frontier settlement into a proper town with a school, a church, several businesses, and even a small lending library that Mrs. Henderson had established to serve the educational needs of the surrounding area. The growth had brought benefits in terms of available goods and services, but it had also brought social complications that made Jake increasingly uncomfortable about his daughter's future in the community. "Well, if it isn't Jake Morrison and his beautiful daughter," called out Samuel Hartwell, owner of the general store and one of the most prominent citizens in Elkhorn Creek. "Snow gets prettier every time I see her. Won't be long before every young man in the territory is beating a path to your door, Jake." The comment was intended as a compliment, but it made Jake's jaw tighten with protective concern as he realized that Snow was indeed becoming a young woman whose beauty and intelligence would inevitably attract attention from suitors. The thought of having to evaluate and potentially reject young men who wanted to court his daughter was almost as daunting as the prospect of eventually having to let her go when she found someone worthy of her affections. "She's still just a child, Sam," Jake replied carefully, "more interested in books than boys, which is exactly how I prefer it." "Papa Jake is being silly," Snow said, with the kind of laugh that made everyone within earshot smile involuntarily. "I'm not interested in boys because none of them are as smart or as interesting as you are. Why would I want to spend time with people who can't keep up with my thoughts?" The innocent honesty of her response made several adults chuckle, but Jake recognized the deeper implications of what his daughter had said. She had spent her entire life in the company of one adult who treated her as an intellectual equal and encouraged her natural curiosity about everything from astronomy to literature. The result was a young girl whose mind had developed far beyond her chronological age, but who had little experience with the social dynamics that would be crucial to her happiness as an adult. Their visit to Mrs. Henderson's school provided both encouragement and concern about Snow's educational progress. The teacher was clearly impressed by the girl's academic achievements, particularly her advanced reading skills and her ability to discuss complex topics with remarkable sophistication. "Mr. Morrison," Mrs. Henderson said privately, while Snow browsed through the new books that had recently arrived from Denver, "your daughter is extraordinarily gifted. Her reading comprehension is at least at a high school level, and her writing shows a maturity of thought that I rarely see in children twice her age." "That's what worries me," Jake admitted. "She's so far ahead academically that I'm afraid she'll never find peers who can challenge her intellectually or understand her interests. There are institutions back east that specialize in educating gifted children," Mrs. Henderson said carefully. "Schools where she could be challenged appropriately and surrounded by other exceptional students. Have you considered that possibility?" The suggestion hit Jake like a physical blow, even though he had known this conversation was inevitable. The idea of sending Snow away to school, possibly for years at a time, went against every protective instinct he had developed during their decade together. But he also recognized that his own limitations as a teacher and the isolation of their mountain home might ultimately limit his daughter's potential in ways that would be unfair to her remarkable gifts. "She wouldn't go," Jake said quietly, "and I'm not sure I could bear to send her away, even if it would be better for her education." "She's young yet," Mrs. Henderson replied diplomatically, "but as she gets older, she's going to need challenges and opportunities that simply aren't available in a small frontier community. You might want to start thinking about what kind of future you want her to have." The trip home to their mountain cabin was quieter than usual, with both Jake and Snow lost in their own thoughts about the changes that seemed to be approaching, whether they wanted them or not. The conversation with Mrs. Henderson had forced Jake to confront the reality that his daughter's exceptional intelligence and emerging beauty would inevitably take her away from the simple mountain life that had been their shared sanctuary for 10 years. That evening, As they sat by the fire with Snow reading aloud from one of her new books while Jake worked on repairing a piece of harness, the domestic peace of their routine felt more precious than ever. This was the life they had built together, the relationship that had given meaning and purpose to Jake's previously solitary existence. But he was beginning to understand that love sometimes required sacrifice, and that the greatest act of love he could perform for his daughter might eventually involve letting her go. "Papa Jake," Snow said suddenly, looking up from her book with the kind of serious expression that usually preceded one of her thoughtful questions, "do you ever regret finding me in the snow? Do you ever wish you could have kept living your quiet life without having to worry about raising a child?" The question pierced Jake's heart with its innocent honesty, and he set aside his work to give his daughter the attention such an important inquiry deserved. "Snow," he said gently, "finding you was the best thing that ever happened to me. Before that night I was just surviving, getting by from one day to the next, without any real purpose or joy. You gave me a reason to build a real life instead of just existing. But your life would have been simpler without me," Snow persisted. "You wouldn't have to worry about education and social opportunities and all the complicated things that come with raising a child." Jake smiled at his daughter's perceptive understanding of the challenges her presence had created, even as his heart swelled with pride at her thoughtfulness. "Simpler, maybe," he said, "but not better. Not even close to better. You've been my greatest joy, Snow, and whatever complications come with that are a small price to pay for the privilege of being your father." As Snow returned to her reading with a satisfied smile, Jake found himself thinking about the future with a mixture of anticipation and dread. His daughter was growing up, developing into a remarkable young woman whose talents and beauty would inevitably take her beyond the boundaries of their mountain sanctuary. But whatever challenges lay ahead, he knew that the love they shared would remain the foundation of both their lives, the unshakable bond that had been forged on a snowy night when fate had brought them together against impossible odds. Subscribe to our channel now to see how Snow's journey continues and what destiny awaits this extraordinary father-daughter pair. Don't miss the next chapter of this heartwarming tale. 5 more years had passed, and Snow Morrison, at 15, had blossomed into a young woman whose beauty and intelligence drew attention wherever she went, but whose heart remained firmly anchored to the mountain home and the man who had saved her life and raised her with such devoted care. The awkward questions about her future that had troubled her childhood had been resolved through a series of compromises that allowed her to receive the education she needed while maintaining the close bond with Jake that defined both their lives. 3 days a week, Snow lived in town with Mrs. Henderson, attending the advanced classes that the teacher had developed specifically for her exceptional needs and working as an assistant instructor for younger children whose academic struggles benefited from her patient tutoring. The remaining 4 days were spent at the mountain cabin with Jake, helping him with the hunting and trapping business that had evolved to include guiding wealthy tourists who wanted to experience the wilderness under the protection of an expert woodsman. The arrangement had worked well for both of them, allowing Snow to develop her considerable academic talents while maintaining the mountain skills and practical wisdom that Jake considered essential to her character. She could track game through difficult terrain, handle a rifle with deadly accuracy, cook gourmet meals over an open fire, and discuss philosophy or literature with equal competence. But more importantly, she had grown into a young woman whose moral character reflected the values Jake had tried to instill through his own example of integrity, self-reliance, and consideration for others. "Papa Jake," Snow said one autumn evening as they sat on the porch of their cabin, watching the sunset paint the mountain peaks in shades of gold and crimson. "Mrs. Henderson received a letter from that college in Boston, the one that offered Me a full scholarship. They want an answer by Christmas. Jake felt his heart clench with the familiar mixture of pride and fear that accompanied any discussion of Snow's future beyond their mountain sanctuary. The scholarship offer from Radcliffe College was an extraordinary opportunity, the kind of chance that came once in a lifetime for someone with Snow's academic gifts. But accepting it would mean separation that could last years, and potentially the end of the life they had built together in their hidden valley. "What do you want to do?" Jake asked carefully, though he dreaded the answer that his daughter's exceptional intelligence made almost inevitable. "I want to stay here with you," Snow replied without hesitation. "I want to keep living the life we've built together, helping you with the business and maybe starting a proper school here in the mountains for children who don't have access to good education." The answer was everything Jake had hoped to hear, but it also filled him with guilt about the possibility that his daughter was limiting her potential out of loyalty to him rather than pursuing her own dreams and ambitions. "Snow," he said gently, "you have gifts that could change the world if you develop them properly. It would be selfish of me to let you waste those gifts just because I can't bear the thought of living without you." "Who says I'd be wasting my gifts?" Snow asked with the kind of passionate conviction that reminded Jake of her fierce independence. "There are children all through these mountains who will never get proper education unless someone brings it. To them, I could make a real difference here, Papa Jake. Help families who don't have the opportunities that wealthy city people take for granted." Before Jake could respond, the sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation, and they looked down the trail to see a group of riders making their way toward the cabin in the gathering dusk. Jake's hand moved instinctively toward the rifle that was never far from reach, but he relaxed when he recognized the lead rider as Dr. William Crawford, a physician from Denver who had become a regular client for guided hunting trips over the past several years. "Jake! Snow!" Dr. Crawford called out as his party approached the cabin. "Hope you don't mind unexpected visitors, but we need to talk to you about something important." The group that dismounted at Jake's cabin included not only Dr. Crawford, but also his son Michael, a young man of 22, who had recently graduated from Harvard Medical School and was preparing to join his father's practice in Denver. Michael Crawford had accompanied his father on previous hunting trips and had developed what Jake suspected was a serious romantic interest in Snow, though the young doctor had been respectful enough to avoid declaring his intentions without first speaking to Jake privately. "Dr. Crawford," Jake said warmly, genuinely pleased to see his friend, despite the potential complications that Michael's presence might bring. "You're always welcome here, you know that. What brings you up the mountain at this time of year?" "Actually, it's Michael who needs to talk to you," Dr. Crawford replied, with the kind of smile that suggested he approved of whatever his son was planning to say. "He's got something important to discuss, and he insisted on making the trip before winter sets in." Michael Crawford stepped forward with the kind of nervous determination that Jake recognized from his own younger days when facing particularly daunting challenges. The young man was clearly intelligent and well-educated, with the kind of character that came from good upbringing and proper values. But more importantly, Jake had observed during previous visits that Michael treated Snow with the kind of respect and genuine affection that suggested his feelings went far deeper than mere physical attraction. "Mr. Morrison," Michael said formally, "I know this might seem sudden, but I've been thinking about this for months, and I can't wait any longer to speak my mind. I'm in love with Snow, and I want to ask for your permission to court her with the intention of marriage." The declaration hung in the mountain air like a challenge to everything Jake had built his life around for the past 15 years. Snow was still just 15 years old, barely more than a child in his eyes, despite her obvious maturity and intelligence. The thought of any young man taking her away from their mountain home filled him with protective fury that was difficult to control. But as Jake looked at his daughter's face, he saw something that stopped his immediate rejection of Michael's proposal cold. Snow was looking at the young doctor with an expression that Jake had never seen before, a combination of affection, respect, and something that might have been love. His little girl had grown up without him fully realizing it, and her heart had apparently been given to someone else while he wasn't paying attention. "Snow," Jake said quietly, "this is your decision as much as mine. How do you feel about Michael's intentions?" Snow looked back and forth between the two most important men in her life, her violet eyes showing the kind of internal struggle that came from having to choose between competing loyalties. "I care for Michael very much," she said carefully, "but I can't bear the thought of leaving you alone in these mountains. You saved my life, Papa Jake, and you've given me everything I am. How can I repay that by abandoning you for my own happiness? By living the life you choose," Jake said simply, though the words felt like they were being torn from his soul. "By being happy and fulfilled and loved by someone who deserves you. That's all I've ever wanted for you, Snow. And it's not abandonment. If it's what's best for your future." Michael stepped forward with the kind of respectful determination that impressed Jake despite his emotional turmoil. "Mr. Morrison," the young doctor said, "I want you to know that I'm not asking Snow to choose between loving you and loving me. You'll always be her father, the man who raised her and shaped her character. I'm hoping that there might be room in her life for both of us." "What exactly are you proposing?" Jake asked, sensing that Michael had given considerable thought to the practical aspects of his courtship rather than just the romantic elements. "I'm proposing to build a medical practice that could serve these mountain communities," Michael replied. "There are hundreds of families scattered through these valleys who have no access to proper health care, children who die from diseases that could be easily treated with proper medical attention. Snow and I could make a real difference here, provide services that are desperately needed while staying close enough to visit you regularly." The proposal was more thoughtful and generous than Jake had expected, offering the possibility of keeping Snow close while still allowing her to pursue a fulfilling life with someone who clearly loved and respected her. But more importantly, it represented exactly the kind of practical idealism that Jake had tried to instill in his daughter's character. "Snow," Jake said quietly, "what do you think about Michael's idea?" "I think it's wonderful," Snow replied, her face glowing with the kind of excitement that Jake hadn't seen since she was a small child, discovering new books. "I could help with the medical practice, use my education to teach families about health and hygiene, maybe even start that school I've been dreaming about. We could build something really meaningful together." As Jake looked at his daughter's radiant happiness and Michael's obvious devotion, he realized that the moment he had been dreading for years had finally arrived. But instead of the devastating loss he had anticipated, he found himself feeling something unexpected. Relief that Snow had found someone worthy of her love, and pride that the woman she had become was capable of inspiring such devotion in a good man. "Michael," Jake said formally, extending his hand to the young doctor, "you have my permission to court my daughter and my blessing on whatever future you build together." The celebration that followed lasted well into the evening, with Dr. Crawford producing a bottle of champagne he had brought specifically for this occasion, and Snow playing her guitar while everyone shared stories and plans for the future. But the moment that Jake treasured most came later, when Snow found him sitting alone on the porch, looking up at the stars that had witnessed so many important moments in their life together. "Papa, Jake," she said softly, settling beside him. On the wooden bench where they had shared countless conversations over the years, "I want you to know that loving Michael doesn't mean I love you any less. You'll always be my hero, the man who saved me and raised me and taught me how to be strong." "I know that, sweetheart," Jake replied, wrapping his arm around his daughter's shoulders for what might be one of their last quiet moments together, as just the two of them. And I want you to know that watching you grow into the woman you've become has been the greatest privilege of my life. Finding you in that snowstorm was the beginning of everything good that's ever happened to me. 2 years later, the wedding of Snow Morrison and Dr. Michael Crawford was celebrated throughout the mountain communities that had come to know and love the remarkable young woman who had grown up in their midst. The ceremony was held in the meadow behind Jake's cabin, with wildflowers providing decoration and the mountain peaks serving as a cathedral worthy of the love being celebrated. As Jake walked his daughter down the makeshift aisle toward the man who would become her husband and partner in life, he reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. The abandoned baby he had found dying in a blizzard had become a woman whose intelligence, beauty, and character enriched the lives of everyone she touched. The lonely mountain man, who had never imagined himself as a father, had discovered that love could transform even the most unlikely circumstances into something beautiful and meaningful. Snow Morrison Crawford would go on to become a legendary figure in Colorado Territory, establishing schools and medical clinics throughout the mountain communities, while raising 4 children who inherited both their mother's exceptional gifts and their grandfather's practical wisdom. But she never forgot the man who had saved her life and given her the foundation of love and values that made everything else possible. And Jake Morrison, who had feared that his daughter's marriage would leave him alone and purposeless, discovered instead that love multiplied rather than diminished when shared. His home became the gathering place for a growing family that included not only Snow and Michael, but also their children, the extended community they served, and the countless lives they touched through their work and example. The baby abandoned in a snowstorm had indeed become his greatest joy, but she had also become something more, the center of a family and community that proved love could triumph over the harshest circumstances and create warmth that would last for generations. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to follow more incredible stories of love, family, and the power of human connection from the Old West. Hit that subscribe button now and join our community of believers in the transformative power of love.